The murmur of voices in the hall had suddenly died away. Deep silence followed. Felicitas heard the front door close, but she did not know that with that dull sound, the drama in the house was over. She did not yet dare to leave her hiding place. She sat on the little cushioned armchair her uncle had given her that last Christmas Eve. Her head rested on her folded hands upon the table. Her heart no longer beat so wildly, but behind the low, bent brow something hammered, and thoughts chased one another in feverish haste. She thought, too, of the little old lady whose bouquet lay out there on the stone floor, now probably crushed beneath careless feet. So that had been the old Mamsell. The solitary soul under the roof of the back building, the constant bone of contention between the cook and Heinrich. According to Friederike, the old Mamsell had something dreadful on her conscience. She was even said to be guilty of her father's death. The hair-raising tale had always filled Felicitas with a child's instinctive horror, but that fear was gone. That gentle face with its kind expression and tear-wet eyes, a murderess of her own father? Impossible. Heinrich must be right when he shook his thick head and said again and again that there must be some other explanation. Years ago, the old Mamsell had lived downstairs in the front house, but, as the cook said with ever-renewed indignation, she would not be dissuaded from playing unholy songs and merry tunes on Sunday afternoons. Madame had held heaven and hell before her, all in vain, until no one in the house could bear the abomination any longer. Then Mr. Hellwig had yielded to his wife, and the old Mamsell had been banished to the attic. There, Friederike said, she could do no harm. And indeed, never since that day had the sound of the forbidden piano playing been heard in the front house. The uncle must have been very angry with her, for he never spoke her name. Yet she had his father's features, unmistakably so. A sudden, hot longing seized Felicitas at the thought. She wanted to climb up to those attic rooms. But there stood stern Johannes. She shuddered at the thought, and besides, the old Mamsell was, as it seemed, locked away behind bolts and bars all year round. At the end of a long corridor lay a door. Nathanael had once whispered to her while they played up there, "Look, that's where she lives." Then he had hammered on the panels with both fists and shouted, "Old roof witch, come down!" After which he had fled in headlong terror down the stairs. How the little girl's heart had thumped! She had not doubted for a moment that some horrible woman with a great knife must burst out and seize her by the hair. Twilight gathered. On the gable cross of the town hall, the last golden ray of the autumn sun flickered. And in the great wall clock, the works slowly rattled out 5 strokes, the same dull notes that had echoed through the house 3 times as the man who had tended that clock so carefully was borne past it for the last time. Until now, it had been very quiet in the house. Suddenly, the sitting-room door opened. Hard, firm steps sounded through the hall. Felicitas drew the curtain closer round herself. Mrs. Hellwig was coming towards her husband's room. To the child, this was something strange and uncanny. It had never yet happened, in all the years of his illness, that the great lady had crossed that threshold. She entered quickly, shot the bolt behind her, and stood still a moment in the middle of the room. An expression of unspeakable triumph lay upon her features as her glance traveled slowly over the space she had so long avoided. Above Hellwig's desk hung 2 well-painted oil portraits, a gentleman and a lady. The latter, a proud face, eyes sparkling with wit and zest for life, wore the costume of that fashion which so awkwardly mimics Greek antiquity. A short bodice of gleaming white silk, tightened still more by a red gold-brocaded girdle. Breast and arms, almost too luxuriantly formed and scantily veiled, were oddly at variance with the small bunch of violets at her belt. This was Helwig's mother. The widow now stepped before this picture and seemed for a moment to gloat over it. Then she mounted a chair, lifted it from the place it had occupied for so many years, and carefully, making as little noise as possible, drove a nail between the two old ones on which she hung the male portrait, Helwig's father. Now he looked down alone. The widow stepped from the chair and left the room, carrying the lady's portrait in her hand. Felicitas listened intently. She heard the firm steps cross the hall, ascend the first flight, higher and higher in the echoing stairwell, no doubt to the attic. The door had not quite closed behind her, and when the last sound on the stairs had faded, Heinrich's anxious face appeared. "Well, there we have it, Friederike," he called softly into the hall. It was the old merchant's widow's picture. The cook flung the door wide and peered in. "Oh, dear Lord, indeed it is," she cried, clasping her hands. "If that proud lady knew it, she'd turn in her grave, and the dear master, too. But she was dressed dreadful, so bare at the breast. A Christian body had to be ashamed." "Think so?" answered Heinrich, slyly blinking. "I'll tell you something, Friederike," he went on, counting on his fingers. "First, the old merchant's widow never wanted our master to marry Madame. That's something Madame never forgives. Second, she was a merry soul, always where the music was. And third, she once called Madame a heartless prayer sister. See the drift?" While Heinrich thus reasoned, Felicitas had stepped from her hiding place. Instinctively, she felt that in this rough but kindly man she might still find protection. He loved her well, and it was chiefly thanks to his watchful eyes that she had remained so long in blissful ignorance of her past. "Well, Fietchen, there you are," he said kindly, taking her small hand into his calloused one. "I've been looking for you everywhere. Come along now into the servants' room. They'll not suffer you here any more, poor little soul. If even the old pictures must go, then—" He sighed and closed the door. Friederike had already scuttled back to her kitchen, for Mrs. Helwig's steps were heard descending. Felicitas cast one timid glance into the hall. It was empty. Where the coffin had stood, crushed flowers and leaves lay scattered upon the floor. "Where is Uncle?" she whispered as Heinrich led her away. "Well, they've carried him off, but you know, child, he's in heaven now. That's a better place for him than earth," answered Heinrich sadly. He took his cap from its peg and went out on an errand. The servants' room lay in deep dusk. Since Heinrich had left, Felicitas knelt upon the wooden bench beneath the barred window, staring up at the little square of darkening sky above the steep gables, where, she thought, her uncle must be now. She started when Friederike came in with the lamp and set a plate of bread and butter on the table. "Come, child, and eat. There's your supper," she said. The little girl came near but did not touch the food. She reached for her slate. Heinrich had brought it from her uncle's room and began to write. Hurried steps sounded in the kitchen. A moment later, Nathanael thrust his fair head through the door. Felicitas trembled. He was always particularly ill-natured when he found her alone. "Aha! So there sits Miss Fee," he cried in the tone she dreaded. "Tell me, you naughty thing, where have you been hiding all the time?" "In the green room," she answered without looking up. "See that you never try that again," he threatened. "You don't belong there now. Mama says. What are you writing? My exercise for Mr. Richter. For Mr. Richter, he repeated with mocking emphasis, wiping all the writing from the slate in one quick movement. So you think Mama is stupid enough to go on paying those expensive private lessons for you? She'll see to that. That's all over, she said. You can go back where you came from. By and by, you'll be just what your mother was, and then they'll treat you as they treated her. He pressed his hands to his cheek as if aiming a gun and shouted, "Bang!" The child stared at him with wide eyes. He had spoken of her mother. That had never happened before. Yet the words sounded unreal, monstrous. You don't know my mama, she whispered. Oh, I know a great deal more of her than you, he scoffed. After a moment, he added, with that sly look from under his lowered brow, I suppose you don't even know what your parents were? She shook her head with touching innocence, but her eyes clung to his lips in fearful entreaty. She knew him too well not to feel that cruelty was coming. They were show folk, he shrieked triumphantly, like the people we saw at the fair, doing tricks and somersaults, and then holding out a plate to beg. The slate fell from her hand and shattered. Felicitas sprang up and rushed, beside herself, past the boy into the kitchen. He lies, doesn't he? He lies, Friederike, she cried, seizing the woman by the arm. That I can hardly say, but he's put it rather strong, answered Friederike, whose hard heart softened at sight of the child's despair. They did not beg, that's true, but show folk they were, right enough. And they did dreadful tricks, added Nathanael, stepping to the hearth to peer into her face. Still she did not weep. She only looked at him with such wild boldness, her eyes blazing, that his anger grew. Horrible tricks, he repeated. Your mother tempted the Lord our God, and for that she will never get into heaven, Mama says. She has not died at all, burst from Felicitas. Her pale little mouth quivered. Her hand clutched the cook's skirt. Oh, long ago, you silly thing. Long, long ago. Papa just never told you. Over in the town hall, she was shot by the soldiers while doing one of her tricks. The tortured child uttered a cry that cut the air, and Friederike's confirming nod proved beyond doubt that the boy had not lied. Just then Heinrich returned. Nathanael vanished at once, sly nature's fear and honest face. The cook, too, felt her conscience stir. She rattled the stove lid unnecessarily. Felicitas screamed no more. She had flung her uplifted arms against the wall and pressed her forehead upon them. One heard only the fierce struggle to choke back sobs. Heinrich had heard the cry. He saw Nathanael slip away behind a door, and he knew at once what had happened. Without a word, he turned the little girl from the wall and lifted her chin. It was terribly distorted. At sight of him, she broke anew into sobs. They have shot my poor little mother! My dear, good Mama! Heinrich's broad face went white with fury. He seemed to choke back an oath. Who told you that? He asked, casting a threatening look at Friederike. The child was silent. The woman stammered through an account of what had happened, busying herself at the hearth to avoid his eyes. Well, I say this much. Nathanael needn't have told her today, she ended. But tomorrow or next day, Madame will question her herself, and she won't handle her with gloves. You may depend on that. Heinrich led Felicitas back to the bench, sat beside her, and tried to soothe her in his rough, honest way. He told her gently of the dreadful accident in the town hall, and said that her Mama, of whom even then people had said she looked like an angel, was now truly in heaven and could see her little fee at every moment. Then he stroked the child's hair with clumsy tenderness, and she broke out once more into convulsive, bitter weeping.